Hello, welcome to Business Incorporated. I'm Ladi Williams. Coming up on the show today, World Bank IMF 2021 spring meetings begin virtually today. And WTO France seals €6 million deal to deepen trade in developing countries. COVAX head says COVID-19 vaccine rollout to exceed 100 countries soon. And we'll begin this week's show with intraday market numbers. Among markets we track in Africa, only the bourse in Egypt is open for trading as the index was down 2.33%. Other markets we track are still closed for the Easter holidays. Market in Kenya ended Thursday's session positive by 1.30%. The GSE in South Africa also ended positive on Thursday by 1.13%, while Nigeria's NSE declined 0.33%. And it was a different picture in the Middle East, where markets we track were open for trading. In UAE, the Abu Dhabi index jumped 1.04% at intraday, while Dubai's index was higher by 0.91%. Elsewhere in the region, Saudi Arabia's index rose marginally by 0.04%. Only the Qatari index was negative at intraday by 0.63%. And European stocks are still closed today for the Easter Monday holiday, but ended higher on Thursday amid a raft of data releases from the region. The Pan-European Stock 600 ended the session up 0.6%, with tech stocks climbing 2% to lead gains as almost all sectors and major bourses closed in positive territory. European investors digested data releases from the region that can offer more clues on the state of the and health of the European economy. Eurozone manufacturing activity grew at its fastest pace on record in March, with its market's final manufacturing PMI coming in at 62.5 compared to February's 57.9. Meanwhile, in London, the FTSE index closed 0.47% higher. The FTSE 100 rose 0.35%, while the FTSE 250 increased by almost 1%. And shares in India led losses in Asia Pacific today, as many major regional markets are still closed for the holidays. The Nifty 50 and BSS Sensex both dropped more than 1% on Monday afternoon trade, as investors grappled with a recent surge in COVID-19 cases. Elsewhere in the region, stocks saw more muted moves. In Japan, the Nikkei 225 rose 0.79% on the day to 30,089 points, while the Topix index advanced 0.6% to close at 1,983 points. South Korea's Kospi closed 0.26% higher at 3,120 points, while MSCI's broadest index of Asia-Pacific shares outside Japan sat below the flat line. Markets in Australia, mainland China, and Hong Kong are closed today for the Easter holidays. And stock futures were higher early today as investors reacted to a strong bounce in U.S. job growth last month amid accelerating vaccine rollout. Futures on the Dow Jones Industrial Average implied an opening gain of about 200 points. S&P 500 futures and NASDAQ 100 futures also traded in positive territory. The Labor Department reported on Friday that non-farm payrolls increased by 916,000 in March, the highest since August 2020, while the unemployment rate fell. Wall Street kicked off the month of April with a strong rally. The S&P 500 jumped more than 1% to top the 4,000 threshold for the first time on Thursday, bringing its 2021 gains to about 7%. Last week's strength came after President Joe Biden introduced his multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure proposal, which focused on rebuilding roads, bridges, and airports, expanding broadband access, and boosting electric vehicle use and updating the country's electric grid. And oil prices edged down in early Asian trade today after OPEC Plus agreed last week to gradually ease some of its production cuts between May and July. Brent crude futures for June fell 0.2% to $64.70 a barrel, while U.S. West Texas Intermediate crude for May was at $61.32 a barrel, down about 0.2%. Both contracts settled up more than $2 a barrel after the OPEC Plus decision, and optimism about energy demand after U.S. President Joe Biden outlined a $2 trillion infrastructure spending plan. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, Russia, and their allies, a group known as OPEC Plus, agreed to ease production curbs by 350,000 barrels per day in May, another 350,000 barrels per day in June, and further 400,000 barrels per day in July. And gold prices held steady in early trade today, buoyed by concerns of inflation after U.S. President Joe Biden announced a $2 trillion plus jobs plan last week. While a stronger dollar and elevated U.S. Treasury yields limited the bullion's upside. Spot gold was flat at $1,728 per ounce, while U.S. gold futures edged up 0.1% to $1,729 per ounce. The U.S. economy created the most jobs in 7 months in March as more Americans got vaccinated and the government doled out additional pandemic relief money, marking the start of what could be the strongest economic performance this year in nearly 4 decades. Among other precious metals, silver rose 0.2% to $25, platinum climbed 0.4% to $1,214, and palladium was trading flat at $2,666. And France is donating approximately €6 million to finance the World Trade Organization's technical assistance programs for developing countries and least developed countries from 2021 to about 2023. The intervention is aimed at improving participants' understanding of global trade rules and standards. According to the statement, a yearly amount of €550,000 will be targeted to support the new phase of the WTO's Chairs program aimed at helping academic institutions in developing countries and LDCs build their expertise in trade policy, international trade economics, international relations, and international economic law. Since the launch of the program, which has been part of the Global Trust Fund for 10 years and is covered by the Technical Assistance Plan, the WTO has provided financial support. The Standards and Trade Development Facility would receive €400,000 annually to help developing countries and LDCs implement food safety, animal health and plant health standards required for international trade and to improve their sanitary and phytosanitary capacity. And one of the leaders of the World Health Organization's vaccine initiative, COVAX, says coronavirus shots should be rolled out to over 100 countries in the next couple of weeks from 84 at present. COVAX, the largest global vaccination program in history, has placed orders for more than 2 billion shots, but most are still come in the second half of the year. Countries like the US, the UK, and Israel, and the developed world in general have marched ahead with their vaccination program since the first shots were approved in late 2020. The US, with 4% of the world's population, has injected about a quarter of the world's COVID shots to date. It's also had the world's highest total number of COVID cases at over 30.6 million and deaths of almost 555,000. On the other end, the scale, more than 30 countries have yet started or have barely commenced vaccinations, including much of Africa, and that's according to the WHO. And Sudan has received a vote of approval on its transitional plan, including gradual accommodation of former rebel fighters into the government after a top security organ of the African Union toured Khartoum this week. A delegation of the African Union Peace and Security Council held sessions with leaders of the transitional government, now under Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok, and the verdict was that Khartoum was on track to ensure the country's full return to democracy. Sudan's approval rating from the AU came on the same week the U.S. announced that Khartoum had paid up its $335 million due to the victims of the U.S. embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania. The payment, part of a court-ordered obligation on Khartoum, means Sudan, which had been removed from the sanctions list of state sponsors of terror, can now trade freely with the world, including access to key credit facilities. And the Central Bank of Kenya has announced the resumption of charges for transactions above 100 Kenyan shillings, effective through bank-specific mobile money wallets that are closely linked to the savings and credit society sector. Banks in Kenya typically deploy two types of mobile banking wallets. In the first model, banks partner with payment service providers to utilize their mobile money wallets to provide a variety of transactions through customers' bank accounts. In the second model, banks invest directly in their own in-house mobile banking wallets to facilitate mobile money and other wallet-based financial services. This second model typically involves a third party as a technology provider. CBK will continue to monitor developments and support the growth of the payments ecosystem to ensure choice, competition, and affordability. And while his mother battled cancer, Goispe Konopi struggled to find a reliable supply of quality medical cannabis for her oncology plan. After a death in 2014, Konopi decided to start South-Grown, a 100% black-owned company that produces medical cannabis for export. Do take a listen.
Goitsi Konobi never imagined he would be growing cannabis for a living. But the struggles with accessing medical cannabis before his mother died from cancer in 2014 left him looking for ways to make quality reliably available. Those answers led him to start South-Grown, a 100% black-owned company that produces medical cannabis for export. In the middle of his 17-hectare farm, the 29-year-old has a sizable cannabis tree which contains the indigenous rooibos and Swazi gold genetic that he uses to cultivate his cannabis.
We are youth-owned, black-owned, African-born, and we are one of the smaller players, in the context of we haven't raised large institutional capital from existing players from Canada or the like. We've largely raised from African venture capitalists who backed our vision and were aligned with our vision.
Due to strict regulations and processes in South Africa, Konobi's dream of being able to sell cannabis for public consumption recently came to life after acquiring domestic and international licenses to cultivate, process, manufacture, distribute, and export THC, CBD, and CBG containing products. CBD is the non-psychoactive ingredient in marijuana which is said to relieve anxiety, while CBG is used for treating pain, inflammation, and in cancer treatments.
We spend about 7.5 million rand, and that went into cultivation, building the facility, the standard operating procedures, the guidelines that you need to conform to, the policies and processes that you are navigating. All of that was costly.
The company's first international clients are based in Australia, Israel, Germany, and Poland. Konopi will be exporting packaged high THC dry cannabis flower, retailing in pharmacies and licensed medical cannabis clinics in 1 gram, 3 grams, and 5 grams formats.
In Australia, for instance, the company that we're working with has a chain of cannabis dispensaries, not only in Canada but also in Australia. So they've got cannabis clinics where you walk in, you see a physician. The physician will give you a prescription. From that prescription gets filled in the dispensary. And those are the kinds of partnerships that we're working with. So in Europe, we're working with a pharmaceutical distributor where it's about exporting the product to them, where they then wholesale it to pharmaceutical or to pharmacies in their jurisdiction, and they then make their margin and we make ours.
Konopi is negotiating to export CBD-infused ready-to-drink beverage line that will include THC for the Canadian market, where Cannabis 2.0 was recently legalized. South-Grown is currently experimenting to create pharmaceutical compounds that treat the conditions and symptoms of many ailments, such as appetite loss, cancer, epilepsy, and mental health conditions like schizophrenia and post-traumatic stress disorder.
And medical cannabis, they're getting some traction with exports. We'll get expectations from the World Bank IMF 2021 spring meeting when we return from this break. Do stay with us. Welcome back. The 2021 spring meetings of the World Bank Group and its National Monetary Fund and related ancillary event begins virtually today, April the 5th. At the heart of these spring meetings are discussions around progress on the work of the institutions. Other featured events include regional briefings, press conferences, and fora focused on international development, issues of debt, economic recovery, vaccines, and climate. Joining me to talk about this year's meeting is Priscilla Bonsu, a foreign legal advisor at a boutique international law firm in New York City. Hello, Priscilla. Great to have you.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me.
Great. So what are your expectations from this year's spring meetings?
Well, yes, the spring meeting of the IMF and the World Bank Group, as you already stated, is taking place in a virtual format again this week. It is ordinarily held twice a year, and this means that a group of leaders from government, from business, from international organizations, civil societies, along with a diverse group of experts from all around the globe will gather up starting today until April 11th. And these experts will assess the damage that the pandemic has caused over the past year and hopefully find a path forward and out of the pandemic. These global leaders will also most likely discuss current developments in the global economy and international financial markets, as well as forecasts for future developments and the possible policy responses. In addition, the IMF's global policy agenda will likely release its updated World Economic Outlook tomorrow, which is Tuesday, April 6th. And according to the managing director of the International Monetary Fund, it will actually include an upgrade to January's forecast for 5.5% of global economic growth. And so it looks rather positive for the economy. It looks like there is a growth headed coming towards us.
All right, looking at the agenda for the meeting, ensuring debt sustainability for economic recovery in Western and Central Africa, how achievable is this, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes. So one of the key challenges and priorities for policymakers in 2021 will be sovereign debt sustainability and the broader issue of financing for development. The COVID-19 pandemic is the most severe and widespread shock that African countries have actually experienced in the past 30 years. And the collapse in economic activity has actually dried up revenues for public expenditures, which was happening precisely at a time when more spending was actually needed to combat the pandemic and to shore up economies. Now, the International Monetary Fund estimates that the African region will need an additional $345 billion to all the way through 2023. But despite the fact that debt sustainability is not an easily achieved goal during the pandemic, the African countries have actually received financial support from several institutions, including the multilateral and regional financial institutions and development agencies. And this program was actually called the Debt Service Standstill Initiative. And this initiative suspends sovereign debt repayments through the end of that year for the least developed countries in the world, which also includes African countries. So my personal take on this is that the international community at this point has to continue to support these efforts and work on a comprehensive framework for proper sovereign debt restructuring, which is an important gap in the global financial system, as debt restructuring will likely be inevitable for several countries in the coming years.
All right, Priscilla, what other key issues would you like to see addressed in this year's meeting?
Yes. Some of the other key issues that will be discussed will probably be how firms can reinvent themselves to create more jobs, and how governments can find ways to transform the crisis into an opportunity for growth, how policymakers can ensure that everyone that everyone benefits from a recovery and to ensure that inequality is not worsened. This particularly includes attention to the ways the pandemic has disproportionately actually affected women and girls. Another important point would be policy options, for example, that countries should have how countries should have to enhance resilient debt financing and to support efficient debt restructuring when needed, and to increase that transparency. And with regard to the pandemic altogether, I think it is important to discuss the work underway in developing countries to prepare for large-scale vaccine rollouts, the strengths and gaps in country readiness, measures to ensure access and distribution, and the importance of partnerships and cooperation across all stakeholders for success. And lastly, I think the global leaders must discuss how COVID-19 has created opportunities and challenges across research, finance, and policy as we work to build more resilient health and economic systems now and in the future.
All right, it seems like a lot of attention is focused on climate change and green investment. What more needs to be done to achieve this globally and especially in Africa?
I think it is crucial to consider investing in nature-based solutions to protect Africa's natural capital and biodiversity. Africa must also focus on self-sufficiency, sustainability, and an increased productivity from its own agricultural sector. It is also important to invest in large-scale renewable energy projects with little impact on the natural environment, and to invest in climate resilient infrastructure. Another very important point is to resist the pressure to roll back already existing environmental legislation. And also African governments must further emphasize local land and water use rights.
All right, before I let you go, let's talk about gender equality now. Do you think that's one area that needs to be discussed at the meeting?
Yes, the pandemic has exacerbated existing inequalities between women and men in almost all areas of life. In fact, various governments around the globe have reported a surge in domestic violence during the pandemic, and that women were on the front line tackling the pandemic. Women in the labor market were also very hit by the pandemic, and that it has further negatively affected work-life balance among women. Lastly, we as an international community have noticed a striking lack of women in COVID-19 decision-making bodies. And for these reasons, I think that gender equality should be a separate topic on the agenda and should be given at least as much attention as all of the other issues mentioned.
All right, Priscilla Bonsu, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing your Easter with us. Do enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, with that, we call it a wrap on Business Incorporated today. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Ladi Williams. Bye for now.